Counseling Association and Motivo for this partnered event as we observe and continue to support Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. Towards the end of the event, we will add a link to an evaluation survey in the chat box. This is the only place the link will be available. Each registrant must be present for the entire event and complete the survey to receive CE credit. You will have until October 31st to complete the evaluation. Today, our panelists will explore self-care strategies counselors can implement into their life and practice, and also discuss ways clinicians can balance their energy between work, personal life, and advocacy. I will now turn it over to our facilitator for today.
Awesome. Thank you, Danielle. And special thanks to ACA and Motivo for hosting and sponsoring this webinar. My name is Dr. Thommi Lawson, and I'm a licensed professional counselor, educator, and supervisor. Today's webinar focuses on self-care of counselors in training, pre-licensed and licensed counselors, clinical supervisors, and counselor educators who identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. I am joined today by two of my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Susan Branco and Dr. Shekila Melchior. Hello, ladies. Please introduce yourself, including your salient identities, clinical background, research interests, and your favorite self-care ritual or activity.
Susan, you want me to go or you like to go first?
Go ahead, Dr. Melchior.
All right, let's see. So of course, in terms of my salient identities, I identify as a Black woman. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am from the Northern Virginia area originally. My faith and spirituality are important to me. In terms of my clinical background, I am a school counselor. It is a big deal for me to be a school counselor. That identity is super strong. So I worked as a high school counselor in rural Virginia for a number of years. And then I worked in a psychiatric hospital setting with individuals who had severe mental disorders, which I enjoyed. And now I work for the Wise family part-time in private practice. I am a counselor educator, so I'm an assistant professor at George Mason University. And my favorite self-care activity, make sure I answered everything I asked, my research interests. My research interests are social justice identity development of counselors, school counselor professional identity, and equity and access for undocumented immigrants, particularly at the K-12 level. My self-care activity that's really important to me that I can't participate in as much now is I take salsa bachata lessons. I am a huge believer of continuing to learn. It exercises a different part of my brain, which I love. So right now, YouTube is my teacher, and I have been enjoying that immensely. Thanks, Thommi.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Melchior. I am Dr. Susan Branco, and I'm a member of the Latinx community. I have an Indigenous background. I identify as cisgender. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm also a licensed professional counselor. That is my primary clinical background, and I have been in the field for over 20 years. And I started out in community mental health, and then I transitioned to independent practice, working primarily with adoptive families and adoptive individuals. My research interests, because I am also a clinical assistant professor, I'm with the Counseling at Northwestern online digital master's clinical mental health program. And those interests include transracial adoption and counseling practices with persons connected to transracial adoption, as well as looking at adoption and specifically transracial adoption through a social justice lens. I also research issues pertaining to counselor of color wellness, training, and supervision. And my favorite self-care activity and ritual that I do, no matter what the weather for the most part, is running outside during the morning. And I also very much enjoy spending boundaried, and we'll talk later about what we mean by that, time with my family.
I love it. Thank you, both Dr. Melchior and Dr. Branco. Again, awesome. I'm Dr. Thommi Lawson, and I identify as a cisgender Black woman. My pronouns are her, she. I've been a practicing clinician since 2012. I'm in private practice in the Columbia, South Carolina area, and I'm an adjunct professor as well. My research interests are primarily focuses on professional identity development of counselors and training. I like working with those newly graduated students and helping to polish them, encourage them, and discuss career counseling because that's my niche. My favorite self-care ritual is starting my morning with some form of activity, be it running or spinning. So I think Dr. Susan and I share that. So our goal today is to discuss ways to strengthen work-life advocacy balance, given the emotional impact of the recent murders and the media coverage. So to our participants, we will be posting a link in the chat with some additional resources to support and strengthen this conversation. So to start off, let's first define self-care. Dr. Melchior, Dr. Branco, how do you guys define self-care?
Just because a lot of my work is focused on social justice, I do believe that self-care is an act of justice and a way of advocating for oneself and for your physical frame, for your soul, for your spiritual frame. I think that we cannot excel specifically as clinicians and advocates without caring for ourselves. So I do view it as an act of self-justice, essentially.
I like that, self-justice.
I have similar sentiments towards how I perceive self-care. I feel that it is really almost to an extent a human right to make sure that we keep ourselves healthy and in all aspects of health, in all aspects of wellness, and that it's a priority that for too long we've been told shouldn't be a priority. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to reinforce that this is a priority that we need to take seriously and do as much as we can every day.
I love both of those definitions. In the first seminar that was kicked off in this series, Dr. A argued that self-care doesn't have to be alone. He offered that looking at self-care through a community lens. And so he discussed when the guys go to the barber shop and how that sense of community is indeed an act of self-care. I really enjoyed that definition. I believe self-care is anything that brings you joy. So if it's cutting the grass that brings you joy, then cut the grass. That's not necessarily the thing that brings me joy, but simply put, when I'm explaining it to my students, it's anything that brings you joy. Awesome. So as we think about the emotional impact, why does it hit Black, Indigenous, and persons of colors counselors differently when we think about self-care and its emotional impact?
I think a lot about, specifically as a Black woman, the superwoman schema and what society has taught specifically Black women about the ways in which they care about themselves, that their bodies are for others, that their time is for others. And so I think as we translate that into a clinical setting, we can kind of embody that moving forward. And we've had to work really hard, I think, in the community to deconstruct that and say, I recognize that I am taking on labor as a racial ethnic minority, as a Black woman. I'm not going to take on this labor, and that in and of itself is self-care. So aside from just what I do to take care of myself, I also am recognizing very quickly that I don't need to take on that labor. And now, of course, that is learned. That is something that I am still actively trying to work on. But that impact, specifically in the season we're in right now, about what to say yes or no to, has been very significant.
I so appreciate that lens, Dr. Melchior, in how we're thinking about self-care and communities of color, specifically when we think about what we now know about the bodily effects of microaggressions and how that can impact our physical health in addition to our mental wellness, and how we're absorbing microaggressions / traumatic incidents on a daily basis by what we're seeing in the news media, by what we're hearing about. So it really does then require us to change how we're thinking about self-care in terms of it's not being selfish, Again, going back to those messages we may have learned for a very long time. It doesn't mean that you are then no longer giving back to your community. It's both and.
Both and. I agree. And I think, if we think about self-care not being selfish or not necessarily being an independent act, I feel like we have also started, we're grieving the loss of community in the fact that we don't have certain rituals anymore that would allow us an opportunity or a safe place to have that community kind of self-care activities, such as graduations, family reunions, weddings, etc. What are y'all thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think about what a student told me in theories class. She identifies as Catholic, and she talked about just the loss she's been experiencing because she can't go take communion. She can't go sit with her priest. And because that was not my own personal identity, I didn't think about the gravity of that for her and what that would look like. So when she was talking about that loss, there is this kind of grieving piece that we don't always acknowledge. So now we're saying there's grief with trauma. And we know that trauma and grief aren't necessarily the same things. You can experience trauma, and as a result, there's grief. So that kind of complexity, I think, is exacerbated in this season. And really trying to figure out how to navigate and take care of ourselves has been incredibly difficult in the midst of it all.
Yeah.
When we are thinking about loss in this circumstance we all find ourselves situated in right now, we also are thinking about ambiguous losses as well, losses that we can't even necessarily name. Certainly with the community that I also situate myself within as someone who's transracially adopted as well, there are losses that we know people have experienced through a lifetime that are now being re-triggered based on the loss that we're all experiencing. And we don't have an end point, which of course is making everything worse and creating more of an ambiguous situation that makes it challenging to figure out how do we continue to care for ourselves when we're not sure this is going to end.
Yeah. I love your use of the word re-triggering, because I then think about when friends or other professionals may come to me and ask questions about some of the recent things that are going on. That to me, at least for me, has been re-triggering and a bit overwhelming because there are some answers that, and I try not to be crass, in my head, I'm like, I don't want to be your history teacher just because you chose not to pay attention in high school. But can either of you speak to that feeling of being overwhelmed by the questions from various individuals coming?
Yeah. Without trying to sound crass as well, that is a struggle for me. I believe that Google exists for a reason. It is not my responsibility to always educate. That makes me tired. And I have to recognize when it's making me tired so I no longer have to participate in that. We are already fighting for our lives, and to fight for my life and on top of that educate you is beyond my capabilities. And I think that giving people room to learn is important, but there are many avenues to do that. And I will say I am most frustrated if the first time you have ever talked about race, talked about it with me, is after something has happened. That means that there's a lack of consciousness, there's a lack of competency that you have. And so I do struggle with that.
It's a similar struggle. Something that really resonated with me during the first panel is when they were discussing how you may be in the midst of a work event or a meeting and we're witnessing brutalization of communities of color at their peak, because of course, certainly this isn't new, but this current exposure media-wise into all communities is relatively newer, and feeling as though you might be existing in some sort of parallel universe because you're grieving and traumatized, but others around you who may not be part of that community are going about their day as if everything's okay. And It certainly leaves you feeling in that kind of second guessing place that often happens when you've been traumatized, and really disoriented almost. So the piece about being asked, particularly to take on new initiatives necessarily at work to help educate others, to educate, for example, students as well as your colleagues, all of those are important, and you balance them, or at least I do, with the wanting to serve and give back, but also quelling the sometimes anger, to be perfectly frank, that on top of everything that you know we're already struggling with, you're asking more from me right now, and I don't necessarily have it to give.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel that.
Yeah, definitely. There's some days we just don't have it to give. Awesome segue. And as we think about that dual identity that we have as counselors, because our profession is very unique. So let's differentiate between personal and professional self-care. As a counselor's professional identity is very unique compared to other professions. We don't have the privilege of taking off a uniform or name badge at the end of the day, right? So talk to me how you differentiate between personal and professional self-care. Can we even, because of our uniqueness of our profession, can we make a differentiation?
Oh, I definitely think we can differentiate. I always carry the advice I was given in my program, where you care but don't carry. And so I work really hard not to bring my work as a clinician in my home. And even as a counselor educator, I think I underestimated the impact my students would have on me, hearing their stories and watching them develop. And so for me personally, the way in which I engage in professional self-care does look different. So after a heavy session, I may go for a walk. I don't like to talk. I have to sit somewhere for about 20 minutes and mind my business. I may not look at my phone, because we love people, but sometimes they will text or they will have something to say. The reality is I can't help you right now, because I was just working with someone who was suicidal, and I can't compartmentalize enough to engage you in this moment. So that was something that was really important for me to learn really early in my career. And then I'm just going to be very transparent. I watch Real Housewives of Atlanta for a reason. And that has been a huge part of my professional self-care. It just moves me differently. It's mindless. And it has helped me tremendously over these past 10 years, really, since I've become a counselor.
I love it.
Well, I have to admit, I'm also a Real Housewives of Atlanta, New Jersey, New York, Beverly Hills sometimes, and that certainly is a wonderful reality TV coping skill. But similarly, I also, through my time as a counselor, really made it a point to do an active ending closure activity before I left my office, to allow as much as possible to leave those concerns and worries of my clients bring to me there at the office, and to do that transition home. Of course, this is now all changed. For me, I've adjusted to it perhaps a little differently, in that I was working as a counselor educator in an online environment. So I had to learn that there is not that natural transition time between your office and back home. So I would do things similar to you, Dr. Melchior, taking a walk outside, leaving my phone in the house, turning it off if need be, setting up parameters that after 6 p.m. Eastern Standard, I'm out of my office. I care about you, but I'll return your email the next day. Same thing goes with weekends. So that's how I kind of merge the personal as well as the professional. I also am self-advocating to let people know that on weekends I'm not going to be texting work-related issues. My supervisor, who I value greatly, always says there's no emergencies in counselor ed. There are in clinical situations, but in counselor education, we don't have those urgent type of emergencies. So it's okay to boundary yourself. And I find that is something that I do to merge both the professional as well as my personal self-care.
You said my favorite word, boundaries. Boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. I'll never forget during my master's program, I have big eyes. And so I felt like when I go to Walmart or Target, people just looked at me and could tell that I'm a therapist, because people would just turn around and just tell me their whole life story. And I wanted a shirt that says I'm a therapist, but I'm not your therapist. And how do I set up these boundaries, right? And so I was so grateful for a professor I had in my master's program to help me think about ways that I can maneuver those situations when I'm out in public, or making those transitions between work and home, saying a sentence out loud, some kind of a ritual that, you know, as I lock my office door, I say my clients' names out loud and say, I'm leaving you here, you'll be safe, and then I can pick you up when I come in the next day, so that they don't figuratively leave with me in the car and I take them home. Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is a great segue as we talk about what does self-care look like now that we're mostly all working from home, right? And so as we think about the multiple roles we play as a clinician, as a counselor, educator, as a counselor, as a person, and as an advocate, what are some self-care strategies that we can begin to embrace? And we've shared some, but what are some other ones? Let's first start talking about as a clinician. What are some self-care strategies that we can embrace if you're in the role of a clinician?
I would actually say definitely have a routine for what it looks like when you end that day as a clinician, but also how you want to start. So whatever you need to do to center yourself before you get into that mode, I think is incredibly important. And then also kind of how you end that day. I think we have a tendency, because we're empaths, that we will kind of expend that energy out, and then we don't realize that we need to fill up our own tank. So being very intentional about what that would look like for you personally.
I agree with having a routine that you're going to stick by, with allowing yourself some grace if perhaps you need some extra sleep here and there. But also, I think the tendency right now is that we're all experiencing collectively what it means not to be racing around as we quickly did pre-pandemic. So now we have lots of extra empty hours, and with air quotes, and the tendency could be, I'll fill all those up with seeing more clients, or I'll take on some more volunteer roles. I've always wanted to do that, and I will now. So then you could err on that. Now you have too many responsibilities that land you in a similar place that you were perhaps pre-pandemic. So I like the idea of keeping things almost status quo in terms of what you have for clients, because now we're also being asked to serve people more than ever before because of what's happening. And if we allow it, we could find ourselves back to a 7-day work week schedule, because you can do that as a counselor, definitely. And there's no one out there that's going to stop you from doing that except yourself. So I encourage the routine and being mindful of how much you're taking on.
Yeah, that's so critical, because I've noticed personally, since we've had this civil unrest, I'm getting more calls to do pro bono service, asking to speak, present, perhaps providing counseling to those frontline workers or police folks. And I certainly want to do community service and be of service, but you have to recognize that, again, it's extra pressure, right? It's that double tax that we pay, and it comes at a cost. Yeah. I also love how you both talked about rituals. One of my rituals is that, since I've started working from home, is that I wear a cardigan as my work attire. And that is the visual signal for members of my household to know that I'm still in work mode. And it's not until that cardigan comes off that I'm no longer working. And that's been very helpful when my husband walks in and he immediately has a question and he sees the cardigan. He was like, "You're working. I will take care of this later," right? And then another thing that I use is reestablishing some kind of commute, right? So I typically have like a 20-minute commute between the home and the office. And so now I'm home. What does that commute time look like? And like Dr. Branco talked about, we don't want to fill it up with something else. And so I still honor that commute time by taking a walk in my neighborhood. So it's a 20-minute walk is my time to relax, clear my mind. I leave the phone at home. The things that I would do during my 20-minute drive is very helpful. Yeah. Yeah. As a counselor educator, I know some of you two have already mentioned one or two things about those boundaries and students and emergencies, but let's kind of dig into that a little bit deeper for our counselor educators.
I had to I had to learn this quickly. I love to be experiential in the classroom, but when I say there were times I would do the most, I was doing the most. And so I was doing too much work sometimes, and then I would find myself stressed out, which was my fault. And so really realizing, how do I do things well where my students are, being taught well, but also taking care of myself. And at the end of the day, that's modeling. I would want my
Mhm.
students to learn that balance early on in their career. And the best way that I can do that is modeling it. So I am just very similar to Susan. There's nothing that you need from me on the weekend, or after a certain time. I've done a very poor job, I feel, this summer, because I've been teaching in the summer and trying to balance like how often I respond, just because they're turning in assignments online and I'm not going to see them. So what I've been trying to do is really be conscious of that and saying, oops, it's getting late, don't respond to that. And now what I've tried to do is, when I need to do emails, I will email them, leave them all in a draft, and then the next morning I'll send them. So at least I know that that's done, and that makes me feel a little bit lighter, as I go into my next day.
I love that.
I'm definitely a proponent of the draft email, because I've learned that sometimes it does alleviate some of my stress if I just have a draft, and then the next morning I can look at it again and make sure that's really what I wanted to say before sending that off during typical business hours. I appreciate that. I'm finding during this time as well that, like the rest of the country, many of our students are grappling and struggling with how to talk about the racial climate and the racial uprising, underlying wounds that were there, or underlying beliefs, are now coming to the forefront. And we as a nation, as we know, are not adept yet at how to have these conversations. And certainly that's translating into the classroom. So I'm finding that there are more needs for instructors to go into different groups and help diffuse or a situation, or facilitate how to have this kind of discussion. And that's the good news. But the part about that that's becoming a bit unbalanced is who's the instructor being asked to do that work. And it's often falling on those instructors who identify as instructors of color or in that community. So I'm learning how clearly I need help with this. I cannot do this by myself. I need at least one other person to come help me facilitate this. So that way I'm not carrying that by myself. And also there's perhaps modeling for other people who might not feel as confident to facilitate those kinds of conversations. But I think it's important that because it would be very easy to take on a lot because we feel so strongly and obligated, really, because this is our community. However, it's also important to model that we don't need to go it alone, and we can seek help.
So key. And so that's a great example of that whole black tax that we alluded to earlier, that extra work that's given because oftentimes we're the only, or it's the issue that represents one of our salient identities. And so I love how you said that, Susan, about being willing to say, hey, I need help. I want to be a part of it, but I need help, because in addition to teaching my 3 classes and, grading and on all these various committees that academic committees, I need help. I can't carry the weight, right? I want to dig a little bit deeper when we're talking about when we're in the classroom. How do you all make space for those conversations in the classroom?
I think it's been interesting to do it specifically online. So I do teach counseling and social justice, and trying to figure out how to transition that class online has been interesting. What I have found with students is the prompts are really important that they are given. And also, when you do have, and I'm speaking specifically to my Black students, to not traumatize them for my white students learning. I think it's really easy to utilize something that could help with their learning, but it's not going to help the Black student in the classroom. So oftentimes I've learned to just say, tell me what you need. Tell me what's not working. And I may do that anonymously if they don't feel comfortable, or I'll do that where they can tell me. But we have a tendency to take agency away from students. They pay for their education, and I think that they deserve to have a say in how that is navigated. The conversations I have had have always been breakout rooms, and students who would be genuinely tired, and they would say, you know, I really just want to rest. So we've done guided imagery in class just to bring them down from heavy spaces. So just really giving them grace and recognizing where we're at.
Like that.
I really appreciate what you said about taking away agency, and it's so easy to fall in the trap that we know what others might need, particularly as counselors also. One thing that I have found extraordinarily helpful, and it's a nod to both you, Dr. Melchior, and my colleague, Dr. Jones, is your information about how to broach in clinical supervision. And I use that also to broach in the classroom. So for me, broaching looks like me being very explicit about my salient identities from the beginning of class, having a very clear statement on how I would like the class to be focused around social justice and multiculturalism, and that sometimes that will be uncomfortable and I won't always get it right, but I'm trying to create a climate of respect where we can all learn from one another, and also acknowledging that there may be days where people are, as a collective group, not in the place that we're going to have this discussion today. But because I've broached it and put it on the table, they know they can later. Students, that just the mere fact, and this makes me sad that they're saying this, but I know it's a reality, the mere fact that I've acknowledged that certain things are happening in this country, and perhaps they hadn't heard it from another instructor, and they felt very validated to hear one person acknowledge that we're going through this and naming what it is, even if we're not having an extenuated discussion today about it. I found that to be really helpful.
I'm so glad you brought up broaching, because I think that's critical, particularly in our roles as counselor educators, and we talk about modeling. What better way to prepare clinicians on how to broach by doing it in the classroom, right? Not waiting until clinical supervision during their practicum and internship experiences to have that conversation. And it sounds like you both agree on, at least for me, and it sounds like you both agree, is how can we find a way to weave in social justice and advocacy in all of our classes, not just classes that are focused on multicultural. So for me, I'm a career counselor. I teach career counseling. I'm always infusing social justice and advocacy in that class because I feel like it's part of our DNA. It's the core of who we are as a clinician, no matter how you identify. Yeah. Another point you all made was about, again, modeling and making space for that discussion. And Susan, I love how you are very intentional with describing the elephant in the room, for the lack of a better word right now, but just being upfront and frank about, your identity and making a safe space, a brave space for your students to start to have those conversations. Is there a particular way that you set that up? I'll give you an example. For me, I start every class with some kind of 5-minute meditation, gratitude, etc., some kind of grounding activity. And then we start having those bigger conversations about things that are going on in the world. Is there a particular technique that you all use?
I was at an institution where we did that exact activity at the start of every class, and each student took a turn to bring in some sort of grounding or meditation or even musical, anything that could collectively get us centered. So I find that to be very helpful. I personally have now taken to, at the start of every class, and this very much relates to my identities, of doing a small presentation on who I am. For the class, and that does include my salient identities. It also includes my professional background as well as my statement that I mentioned to you earlier. And I do that really so I can be as transparent as possible and let students know that I'm going to be learning so much about you because of assignments or watching recordings or all those different things that we do, that I want you to know as much about me. This also includes my self-care activities as possible, so that we can really have as much as one can, like what you do in counseling, more even playing field. And that I found has really helped kind of kick off the course in a way that's being transparent and genuine.
Love that idea.
Yeah, I would echo that. And I would just also add something that I do at the start of every class is I ask my students what their learning style is and how they like to receive feedback. I think that teaches them very early how to learn that. And of course, when you get into supervision, feedback becomes very critical. And so I try to engage in that early on with my students, and then just asking them kind of what is end game for them. What do they desire for their career to look like and what that could be? And mainly because I think that can really inform where I take the class. So I am a believer that, yes, I have a syllabus and there are things that I start with, but at the end of the day, I want you to be a strong clinician. And so that's the most important thing. So whenever I'm teaching, that is what I have in mind. How do I make you a strong clinician? And how do I get you to see that the people that are standing before you, that it is a privilege to be a counselor. It is an honor for someone to sit in your space. And so when you learn about them and their identities, that in turn informs the type of advocate you could become. And so I know that that played a significant role in my advocacy work with undocumented immigrants was because of the student that sat in front of me. So just helping them to understand that very early on in their training. And even as clinicians, when we're working with someone, why is that moving you? Why is it resonating with you, that person's story or their identities? And how do we translate that into advocacy efforts?
I love that. I love that. Awesome transition into talking about our role as an advocate, Dr. Melchior, because that is also one of the multiple roles that we play. So what are some self-care strategies that you would share as we think about our role as an advocate?
I guess I'll go ahead and go. I do not watch the news. I read the news. I read the news because I have control. When I watch the news, it's repetitive. It's a little more abrasive. And so I prefer to read the news. That's something that's really has worked for me for a number of years now. And I try to recognize when social media is stirring up something in me that I can't bring back down quick enough. So if my anger is rising up and then I'm going to have to go maybe teach a class, you're going to get a very different Dr. Melchior than if I didn't read something or look at something on social media. Because of what's happened in the Black community, I know the evidence of body cam and videos, I refuse to watch them. I don't think it's necessary for me to watch that. I think that's to each its own, but I do not watch them. I can read and understand context without having to see one of my Black brothers or sisters on the ground. That doesn't serve me any purpose.
Similarly, during daytime working hours, I will not engage in looking at any kind of news because, much like yourself, Dr. Melchior, it will offset my balance for the day, and it won't leave me in a place where I can be receptive and open to the things I need to do. For me also as an advocate, I see volunteering as self-care. Volunteering, of course, with boundaries like we've discussed, meaning right now in my community, there was a great need, both by the pandemic as well as a result of administration's legal rulings towards persons who may not have documentation. So the need has increased, and I find that it's fulfilling to me to meet some of those needs, not all of them by myself, but as part of a community, so that it still does keep me engaged. It makes me feel like I'm connected and I'm giving back, but I don't do that all day, every day. I have a very specified time that I've made known my availability. So for me, that's one way that I find advocacy merges with self-care.
Yeah. I too have just partnered with 2 organizations that I commit my time with. And so I limit that volunteer work to those 2 organizations. It just helps me to stay focused and so that I don't have requests coming all over because I can easily just spread myself too thin. I remember a quote, I can't remember who shared it, was it Dr. Melchior or Dr. Branco, about that, how can you advocate for someone else if you're not willing to advocate for yourself? How can you advocate for someone if you're not even able to advocate for yourself? When you hear that question, what pops up?
For me, it makes me think of the necessity to have at least one, truly, at least one person in each of those fields that you could turn to. By that, I mean at least one person in your personal life that can be there for you no matter what. Someone in your professional life that you can know that if you text and say, I really need to talk, they will move mountains to be able to FaceTime you or talk with you, to be there for you so you can talk about some of the harms that happen to you throughout the day. As well as an advocate, having someone that you feel connected to in the community, and it may not be as intimate as those other relationships, but someone that you know you can go to who will validate what you're experiencing, who believes in the mission that you believe in. And all of those areas require you to self-advocate for yourself so that you can be well.
I love it.
Yeah,
I love it.
absolutely. The community is huge, especially with peer mentorship and just mentorship in general, watching someone who's gone ahead of you or who's working alongside you, and they can say, okay, that's too much. You don't need to commit to that. Or at this point of your career, that would not be reasonable for you to do. I don't think there's any growth in isolation. And so when we try to operate in that isolated space, we do miss out on others who can help us and guide us along and teach us those boundaries, a kind of across that. I think it can be really easy because we want to do well in our careers. So when you want to do well, sometimes you don't have good boundaries. And so you can do well and have good boundaries. I think that is something we learn through mistakes, but also from others. I would prefer to learn more from others than from my own mistakes.
I love that. I have to write that down. You can do well and have good boundaries. That's so critical. And I love how you both talk about community and that need for peer mentorship. And I think about, when I think about how can I, if I'm not able to advocate for myself, how can I advocate for someone else? I think about those microaggressions, right? There's a great video on YouTube that relates microaggressions to mosquito bites and how over time, you just can infect you or affect you. And you need that safe space to go back to care for those wounds, right? Or if you're in that situation and you're standing up and advocating for yourself and saying, hey, I don't appreciate you saying XYZ, or did you recognize when you say ABC, how that could be hurtful or harmful to someone? And so, being in those spaces, having courage to advocate, speak up, but then also having that safe space to go back and rest and mend and be well. Yeah, awesome. So we all phrase work-life balance. So what does that look like for a counselor who's balancing work, life, and advocacy? Is there even such a thing as a balance?
I think extending yourself grace to know when you're in a season that it may not be a strong balance. I think sometimes that's a good start, is just saying, I, right now in this present moment, don't have good work-life balance. And then take a step back and figure out where that disconnect is. But there's times where you may have strong balance in one area of life and poor balance in the other. And I think once that kind of swells up in us, we get overwhelmed then, and then we overcompensate. And then now that's just problematic, right? Because then we're getting into a point where we're like overwhelmed by the whole experience. And so something as simple as just saying, you know what, I need to actually have a calendar and create a whole schedule, since I can't seem to figure out that balance. And I know it may sound silly, but I've learned to put things that I enjoy in my calendar therefore work cannot impede on that part because it is literally in my calendar. If I'm getting my nails done at 11 a.m., I can't be on the phone. I can't engage in a meeting. Even if I'm just sitting there, I can't help you. So those little things like that, I think really have helped me be able to find balance.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate what you're saying, to acknowledge and extend grace to ourselves, that this summer, for me personally, is not a good work-life balance going on. But I will commit to the fall being different, because different things will be happening. Part of that for me also is having a partner whom I trust in the community, that can be my accountability partner, to ensure that I am doing some semblance of self-care on a routine daily basis. And they're the people that will be able to remind me and can honestly say to me, you're doing too much. You're starting to go the other direction. We understand why you do that, but I'm seeing this in you, and I'm really letting you know that it needs to be back a little bit in more harmony, which is something I think the three of us spoke about, that maybe balance isn't exactly going to happen this quarter or this season, but how could we be more harmonious with everything for our wellness?
Well, I want to first talk about modeling. You both had the courage and willing to be vulnerable and transparent to say, you know what, I'm not necessarily doing a great job right now. You know, that takes courage, right? And so a great opportunity to model for those on this call and others that speak up, say your truth, and have that support system that says, you know what, I want to be accountable, right? That's critical. And yes, when it comes to balance, I don't subscribe to the word balance. I feel like balance only leads to more anxiety. I feel like we have to find a way to create harmony, because when you think about balance, and so we tend to stretch ourselves because I have to make up here because I didn't do this. But just recognizing and acknowledging that there's an ebb and a flow to things right now. Thinking back to this pandemic where things change so quickly, right? And so again, extending yourself grace that time to make those necessary adjustments, and recognizing that those adjustments are not a one-time event, right? Let's go back and review it, tweak it when necessary. Yeah. One of the things I do, because I was not doing well with boundaries, is I had to set up a fake client and that fake client is me. Because in my head, when I see and I'm scheduling, I'm like, oh, I automatically see if something's booked, I know not to extend that to a potential client. So the fake client forces me to honor that time just for me. And so that's a little trick I've been doing, and it's been working really, really well. I love it. I love it. I think we have about 5 more minutes, and I want to take the questions that came in. And then we'll do our closing thoughts. One of the questions was, counselors that reside in low-income areas may have less resources to self-care than those in more affluent areas. Do you have any suggestions for those counselors that might feel isolated or have fewer opportunities for self-care?
That's a great question. I guess I could speak to that a little bit, just having lived in a low-income, but particularly rural area where the hangout spot was Texas Roadhouse, and there wasn't really much you could do. One thing I have learned is, and actually, Thommi, you said this, that self-care doesn't have to be monetized. There are so many things that you can do to take care of yourself that don't money, but also you can build up for something. Of course, this is pre-pandemic, and I'm believing after. But what has helped me in the past is I actually was saving my money. I knew I was going to go to somebody. I was going to Cancun. I didn't know where I was going, but I was saving that money for that. And just as a motivating factor to have that vacation was really helpful. And then in the midst of that, I could participate in that my self-care. To me, self-care is not always bubble baths and candles, my house clean, knowing what my schedule is. And so those little small things become soon in areas that maybe we don't have as much access. And I was near Greensboro, so my idea was, okay, once a month, I'm gonna drive to Greensboro and I'm gonna go to Cheesecake Factory. And so to some who live in bigger areas, that sounds small or trivial, but to those who live in really small rural areas or low income areas that can't reach things, that became incredibly useful.
I like that.
I also find even if you're not necessarily in access to greenery or nature, just opening the window on some days and having one plant, which is really probably the max that I can manage with making sure it stays alive, and nurturing it and growing it and having greenery also really can sometimes be, even if momentarily, a way to help yourself with your wellness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I definitely encourage my students from day one. I love my brand new students in Intro to Counseling, and I challenge them to self-care activities that don't come with a price tag. So I start there, and then I give them permission to, it can't exceed $10, right? Because I don't want them to always think that self-care is a manicure, pedicure, massage, those kind of things. While all of those things are great, what if, life throws you a curveball? What if we have a pandemic and you can't get to those things? What then? And so having that list, that go-to of things that bring you joy, that you can pull up and say, okay, this is my form of self-care. Just yesterday, a student emailed me a picture of her with a face mask on with her daughter. And she's like, this is my self-care, Dr. Lawson. And it was so much fun. It was a community activity, a family activity rather. And she said she never would normally make time for herself, put on a face mask, something as simple as that cost $1 from Ulta, brought her joy. Yeah, I love it. So we have about 2 more minutes. I want to make sure I leave room for any closing statements. I'll also want to remind everyone that we do have additional resources that we put together, and the link will be in the chat. And then I also want to note that all 3 of us are connected on LinkedIn. And so in your closing remarks, please include your LinkedIn. How are you listed in LinkedIn? Dr. Melchior?
Yes, so I believe my LinkedIn is that / Shekila M. I know my name is a doozy, but you can see it there, up there. My closing remarks really would be, you are incredibly valuable. And because you are incredibly valuable, you need to extend yourself the kindness that your students and your family. The best way to be full of joy and to live life in a way that you think is meaningful is to take care of yourself. And so the minute that we are able to recognize our own value, the more we will better take care of ourselves. And so, yeah, just remembering that you are incredibly valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's so true, Dr. Melchior. I'm sitting here feeling so grateful and honored to have spent this hour with all of you. And I really enjoyed being able to talk about self-care and wellness. And I hope you know that the act of being here was self-care for you, and that your voices are important. And we need you to stay in this field, because mental health really needs as many really qualified providers as possible right now. Please find some time to really reflect on what we talked about today and choose something that's going to work for you, and also choose to know that that might change. That's okay as well. So thank you all so very much.
Yeah, give yourself permission to pivot, right? Don't get so locked in. Dr. Melchior, I'm still stuck on your statement. You can do well and have good boundaries. That's definitely what I'm walking away with. I have a t-shirt that says kindness is so gangsta, and I believe that when we extend kindness to ourselves, wow, how gangsta is that, right? And that recognize that kindness, that self-care is an act of social justice, and so we have to be intentional in making room for that. And so those boundaries, setting those boundaries, and not only setting them but honoring those boundaries, and by honoring those boundaries we indeed honor our truth. This has been great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Drs. Melchior and Dr. Branco, for joining me on this discussion.
Thank you to our panelists for such an insightful and informative discussion on self-care and wellness for minoritized counselors. Just as a reminder, you must complete the evaluation survey to receive credit for this event. Details are located within the chat box. On behalf of the American Counseling Association and Motivo, thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.